All right, ready to dive into some ancient philosophy. Today we're going to be exploring the life and thought of Antiochus of Ascalon, a figure who really kind of shook things up back in the late 2nd century BCE.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character. I think especially for a philosopher like you, his story, it really takes us right into the heart of a period of intense philosophical debate and transformation in the ancient world.
So paint the scene for us. Where do we find Antiochus?
You got to picture ancient Athens just bustling with intellectual energy. It's within the walls of Plato's Academy, this, prestigious hub of philosophical discourse. That's where we first encounter Antiochus.
The Academy, steeped in history and philosophical heavyweights? What's the intellectual climate like when Antiochus arrives on the scene?
Well, it's a time when skepticism is having, a major moment. Think of it as a philosophical approach that constantly questions everything, doubting the possibility of certain knowledge. It's like Socrates' method of questioning just taken to a whole new level.
Skepticism, the ultimate philosophical challenge. Did Antiochus buy into this skeptical worldview right away?
He did initially. In fact, he even wrote in defense of skepticism. But then, and this is where things take a fascinating turn, he makes a dramatic shift.
A philosophical U-turn, huh? I'm intrigued. What prompted this change of heart?
Well, that's a question that scholars still debate. Unfortunately, the sources don't give us a clear answer. But what we do know is that Antiochus became a staunch advocate for the possibility of knowledge. He even claimed to be reviving the old academy, arguing that Plato and his early followers weren't actually skeptics at all.
That's a bold move, reinterpreting the legacy of Plato himself. How did his contemporaries react to this?
It definitely caused a stir. His former teacher, Philo of Larissa, a committed skeptic, directly challenged Antiochus's interpretation of the Academy's history.
Sounds like there's some philosophical tension brewing. How did this clash of ideas play out?
Well, Philo revised his own understanding of the Academy's history, arguing that it had always been skeptical, just not in the way that the Stoics, another major philosophical school at the time, understood it.
So I've got Antiochus rejecting skepticism, reinterpreting the Academy's legacy, and sparking a debate with his former teacher. I'm sensing a theme of, challenging the status quo here. Where does Stoicism fit into all of this?
That's where it gets even more interesting. You see, Antiochus's newfound belief in knowledge aligned almost perfectly with Stoic philosophy.
So did he essentially become a Stoic in disguise?
Not quite. He insisted that the old academy, Aristotle's followers, known as the Peripatetics, and the Stoics were all fundamentally in agreement. He saw himself as a kind of bridge builder, using Stoic ideas to support his interpretation of the old academy.
Trying to reconcile three major philosophical schools of thought? That's some serious intellectual ambition. It makes you wonder, was he truly a faithful interpreter of the old academy, or was this like a clever way to integrate Stoic ideas? This philosophical puzzle is something for you to ponder.
Indeed. Now, shifting gears from knowledge to the good life, Antiochus's ethical views offer another layer of intrigue. Here, he finds common ground with Aristotle, asserting that while virtue is essential for happiness, it's not the only thing that matters.
Interesting. How does that contrast with the Stoic take on happiness?
Well, the Stoics held a rather strict view, believing that virtue, or the perfection of reason, was the sole good and the only path to true happiness.
So for the Stoics, virtue was the be-all and end-all of a good life.
Absolutely. However, Antiochus, echoing Aristotle, recognized the value of other things like health, wealth, and strength in contributing to a flourishing life.
So he's finding a middle ground between the Stoic emphasis on virtue and Aristotle's more inclusive view of happiness.
Precisely. But he doesn't stop there. Antiochus introduces a fascinating distinction between being happy and being completely happy. This is where he really starts to carve out his own, unique philosophical space.
All right, let's unpack this happiness spectrum. What's the difference between simply being happy and achieving complete happiness, according to Antiochus?
For Antiochus, living a virtuous life alone could lead to a happy life, what he termed vita beata. But to reach a state of complete happiness, vita beatissima, you'd also need those other goods, the health, wealth, and external factors that Aristotle emphasized.
So it's like there are tiers of happiness. Virtue gets you to one level, but to reach peak happiness, you need those external bonuses too.
Exactly. And this nuanced view of happiness really sets him apart from both the Stoics and Aristotle, offering a perspective that you, as a philosopher, might find particularly thought-provoking. It raises questions about the interplay of internal virtues and external factors in shaping a truly fulfilling life.
I'm already starting to see why Antiochus is considered such a pivotal figure. especially with this unique perspective on happiness. But before we go any further, let's take a quick pause to recap what we've uncovered so far.
Certainly. We've established that Antiochus was a, bold thinker who wasn't afraid to challenge established views. He rejected the prevailing skepticism of his time, reinterpreted Plato's legacy, and sought to reconcile the seemingly disparate philosophies of the Old Academy, the Peripatetics, and the Stoics.
And let's not forget his intriguing concept of a happiness spectrum, adding an extra layer of complexity to the ancient debate on what constitutes a good life. But this is just the tip of the philosophical iceberg.
Indeed, we've only just begun to explore the depths of Antiochus's thought.
So stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into the mind of this fascinating ancient philosopher.
Now, building on Antiochus's, rejection of skepticism, I think you'll find his approach to knowledge particularly intriguing. He tackles this problem of how we can be certain about anything at all.
Okay, that's like a fundamental question of philosophy, right?
Yeah.
How did he go about addressing this like age-old problem?
Well, he drew heavily from Stoic epistemology, which centered on the concept of cognitive impressions.
Cognitive impressions. For those of us who, aren't Stoic scholars, could you unpack that a bit?
Imagine having a perception so clear, so vivid, that it leaves absolutely no room for doubt. That's what the Stoics called a cognitive impression. Think of it like seeing the sun on a clear day. You just know it's there, right? There's no questioning it.
So it's like a perception that's so powerful, so undeniable, that it kind of guarantees the truth of what it represents.
Precisely. And the Stoics believed that by basing our knowledge on these cognitive impressions, we could achieve absolute certainty and avoid falling into error.
Sounds like a recipe for, like, epistemological confidence. But where did the skeptics fit into all of this? I imagine they had some objections.
Oh, they absolutely did. The skeptics, especially those following in Plato's footsteps at the Academy, raised serious doubts about whether these so-called cognitive impressions even existed.
So they were questioning whether we could ever have perceptions that were completely foolproof, like a perfect reflection of reality.
Exactly. They argued that our senses can deceive us, that our perceptions can be colored by our beliefs and emotions, and that
So the skeptics were saying, look, even if we can't have perfect knowledge based on those, undeniable perceptions, we can still use these probable impressions to guide our beliefs and actions. But Antiochus wasn't having it.
he wasn't. He argued that probable impressions were simply not a strong enough foundation for, knowledge or action. Without the certainty of cognitive impressions, he believed our actions and beliefs would be constantly vulnerable to doubt and error.
So for Antiochus, it was all about having that unshakable foundation, that bedrock of certainty based on those like crystal clear cognitive impressions. It seems like his interpretation of Stoic epistemology set him on a kind of collision course with the skeptics.
Absolutely. And his former teacher, Philo of Larissa, presented a particularly nuanced counterargument.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about Philo's perspective. How did he navigate this debate?
Philo, while remaining a skeptic, didn't completely deny the possibility of knowledge. He argued that true knowledge could be based on impressions that were accurate and true, even if they didn't, meet the strict criteria that the Stoics demanded for their cognitive impressions.
So he was essentially saying that the Stoics were like setting the bar too high for knowledge.
Exactly. He believed their definition of cognitive impressions was too rigid, too demanding.
It sounds like he was trying to find a middle ground, a way to acknowledge the challenges of skepticism without, like, completely abandoning the pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah.
How did Antiochus respond to this, like, more moderate form of skepticism?
He saw it as a dangerous slippery slope.
Yeah.
He argued that if we loosen the criteria for knowledge, as Philo suggested, we risk undermining the very foundation, upon which knowledge is built.
So for Antiochus, maintaining those, like, strict Stoic-inspired criteria for cognitive impressions was essential for safeguarding knowledge itself.
Precisely. And this, back and forth between Antiochus and Philo really highlights the core tension between, like, dogmatism and skepticism in ancient philosophy, a tension that continues to resonate in philosophical debates today.
It's fascinating to see how these different schools of thought grappled with the fundamental questions of knowledge and certainty. And Antiochus, with his unwavering commitment to the Stoic notion of cognitive impressions, stands as a, like, firm representative of the dogmatist camp.
He does. But it's important to note that even though he ultimately sided with the dogmatists, his engagement with skepticism forced him to, sharpen his arguments, and deepen his understanding of what it means to, know something.
That's a valuable takeaway. Even when we disagree with the philosophical perspective, wrestling with his challenges can, refine and strengthen our own views.
Mm.
But let's not forget that Antiochus's philosophical contributions go beyond epistemology. He also delved into ethics and developed a unique perspective on the nature of happiness, as we discussed earlier.
Absolutely. And as we shift our focus to his ethical views, we'll see how he attempts to reconcile the thought of the Stoics and Aristotle, kind of weaving together seemingly disparate threads into a cohesive ethical tapestry.
Okay, so we've explored Antiochus's, rejection of skepticism and his take on knowledge rooted in those Stoic cognitive impressions. But there's another kind of dimension to his thought that I'm really eager to delve into. His views on ethics, specifically his ideas about happiness. Earlier, you mentioned that he navigated between, the Stoic and Aristotelian perspectives.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear more about how he developed his own, ethical framework.
Well, to understand Antiochus's ethics, we need to kind of remember that he was grappling with one of the central questions in ancient philosophy. What is the ultimate goal of human life? What truly makes us happy?
Right, it's the age-old quest for the good life. And as we've seen, different philosophical schools had very different answers. The Stoics, with their emphasis on virtue as the sole good, offered a rather demanding path to happiness.
Yes. For the Stoics, happiness was all about achieving a state of perfect rationality, aligning your will with the rational order of the cosmos.
And Aristotle, if I recall correctly, had a more kind of inclusive view, suggesting that while virtue is essential, other factors like health, wealth, and friendship also contributed to a flourishing life.
You're exactly right. Aristotle believed that true happiness, or eudaimonia, involved the fulfillment of our human potential in all its aspects, not just the, intellectual or moral dimension.
So we had the Stoics on one end of the spectrum, focusing solely on virtue, and Aristotle on the other, advocating for a more kind of well-rounded approach to happiness. Where does Antiochus fit into this, philosophical landscape?
This is where it gets fascinating. Antiochus attempts to bridge the gap between these two seemingly opposing views. He argues that while virtue is indeed the, highest good, it's not the only ingredient in a happy life.
So like Aristotle, he acknowledges that factors beyond virtue play a role in our, overall well-being. But how does he reconcile this with the Stoic emphasis on virtue as the sole path to happiness?
This is where Antiochus's creativity as a philosopher, really shines through. He introduces a distinction between what he calls a happy life, or vita beata, and a completely happy life, or vita beatissima.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. What's the difference between these two levels of happiness?
For Antiochus, a happy life, vita beata, is attainable through virtue alone. By cultivating our moral character and living in accordance with reason, we can achieve a, genuinely fulfilling and meaningful life.
So that's aligned with the Stoic idea that virtue is sufficient for happiness. But what about the completely happy life? What does that entail?
To reach vita beatissima, to experience complete happiness, you need more than just virtue. You also need those, external goods that Aristotle emphasized: health, wealth, a supportive social network, and so on.
So it's there are tiers of happiness. Virtue gets you to a certain level, but to kind of max out on happiness, you need those external bonuses as well.
Exactly. And this nuanced view of happiness is really what sets Antiochus apart. He's not simply siding with the Stoics or Aristotle, but forging his own path, integrating insights from both schools of thought. It's a perspective that you as a philosopher might find particularly resonant.
Absolutely. It makes you think about the, complex interplay between our internal state of virtue and those external factors that can either enhance or diminish our overall sense of well-being. It's a reminder that the pursuit of happiness is a multifaceted endeavor.
Indeed. And Antiochus's unique approach to ethics reflects his broader philosophical project of, synthesizing and reconciling different schools of thought. He saw value in both the Stoic emphasis on virtue and the Aristotelian recognition of the importance of, external goods.
This deep dive into Antiochus of Ascalon has been a real eye-opener. He's a philosopher who deserves far more recognition for his nuanced and insightful contributions to, ancient thought.
I couldn't agree more. He challenged conventions, bridged philosophical divides, and left us with a kind of rich legacy of ideas to ponder.
Well, it's time for us to surface from this deep dive into the world of ancient philosophy. But I'd like to leave our listeners, especially those who share a passion for, philosophical inquiry, with a final thought.
What resonates most with you about Antiochus's philosophy? Does his attempt to reconcile the Stoics and Aristotle hold up under scrutiny? And what about that idea of a happiness spectrum? Does it offer a, compelling framework for understanding the complexities of human flourishing? These are questions that, continue to spark debate and reflection even centuries after Antiochus walked the halls of Plato's Academy.
So until next time, keep diving deep, keep questioning, and keep the philosophical conversation alive.